And welcome to a new show called It's Not Your Fault. Now with me, I have Steve Shank, who is the author of the book, It's Not Your Fault. And you're going to love what we're going to talk about every week on the show. Now my name's Kim Power-Stilson, and I'm a talk radio host on Sirius XM, and I have been doing this for years and years. And one of the most fascinating people I have met in the 10 years I have been doing talk show hosting is Steve Shank. Now, Steve is not only an author, like I said, of It's Not Your Fault, the name of this show and the name of his book, but Steve is also a food entrepreneur. He has taken companies from beginning and provided a solution that is so valuable and so important that I actually caught Steve on the Alex Jones show this last week. Now, Alex Jones, as you know, is a great talk show host. He's everywhere. InfoWars is his big, what he's known for. And Steve, I caught your interview on InfoWars, and of course, I already met you. I'd read a copy of your book. I was so intrigued by it. I was so intrigued that I've actually taken it home, applied it to my children, my teenage children who really need it. And I watched your show and I thought, wow, this is a powerful solution that people all over the nation really could benefit from moms who are struggling with depression to teens to baby boomers who are like, what now? You find a way with what you share to provide a solution, and then you also add a way for us to each find our own personal magnificence. And if you don't believe me, you got to listen to what he has to say, and you will see through the show what Steve's about. Now, Steve, like I said, you're on Alex Jones show. You were on that show for your company, one of your companies, which is a food solution company.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And it's something that you're known for speaking about. You're a food expert. You have found a way to provide storable foods that people can put away to secure their futures and eat now. They're so delicious as well. Will you tell us a little bit about that before we talk about your book?
Yeah, you got to understand that I was raised by an you have to call him a pioneer. He was born in 1887. He was 62 when I was born.
This is your father.
That was my father. And he had some interesting perspectives. Back then, the old-timers always had a supply of food because there was not, the shopping malls, and we didn't have chain stores and supermarkets. We just had the little mom-and-pop stores that filled in around what you grew in your garden. And my whole family went through the Great Depression. I'm the only one that didn't. I was born in 41, and so I kind of missed that. But we had all the post-Depression mentality that said, you're independent. You do not depend on anyone else because the only one you can depend on is you, because that's just the way life is. And
that's how you were raised.
Yeah, that's how I was raised. And the old-timers were all fiercely independent. They didn't want to be beholden to nobody because they understood a principle that we talk about in the book and that people will hear about a great deal, and it has a lot to do with how you feel about yourself. And this principle is very simple. The extent to which you're dependent is the extent to which you've given power over yourself to that on which you depend. We all know people who are dependent on relationships. Some wives whose husbands won't let them touch any of the money and won't let them know what's going on in the bank accounts and paying the bills and whether the house is paid for or whether it's not. They are just so dependent, the men keep them so dependent on them that if something happens to them, they're absolutely lost. And so people fear, here's something that you need to think about, and you'll find that it's absolutely true, and that's anytime you have a dependency, there's always a fear connected with it. And if you look at any fear, every single fear that we have in our lives is as a result of the potential of a threat to some dependency.
Okay, for example.
Okay. Relationships. If relationships start to go bad, people who are dependent on those relationships become very afraid. Okay? We're afraid of losing our jobs. What dependency is that? If we lose our job, all of the debt that we've created, other dependencies on the job for the debt, you see, we have fears connected with the dependency. Someone who has no job can't afford food. I've been in a situation where I had to write a hot check. Don't listen to this. Don't do what I do what I say. Anyway, where I had to write a hot check and then run out in sales and sell something the next day to get the money into the account to buy groceries for my kids and my wife. That's a dependency, and it's a fear. Think about it. You take any fear that you've got, you can always track it back to some dependency that's being threatened.
Okay, so if we stop for a moment and everybody listen to that and kind of thinks about their own life, are there, Steve, more than one? I mean, obviously people have more than one dependencies, and are all of them governed by fear?
They're not governed by fear. If those dependencies are threatened, you're afraid of the outcome. Losing your job, losing a relationship, losing your health. You're dependent on your health. Not having enough food. All of the things that we're dealing with. Children are dependent on their parents. Wives are dependent on their husbands. Husbands are dependent on wives. And the way you deal with these is, why do they call freedom Independence Day?
July 4th,
4th
right.
of July. We are independent, therefore we need not fear that on which we are dependent, because we have fought to become independent.
So now with the economy, like I said, I heard you on the Alex Jones shows, and I know that you can go to your eFoods site, efoodsdirect.com site, and see those, or go to the Steve Shank web, Facebook and websites. Okay, because I will keep referencing those. Things are tough right now. I mean, I heard you talking about there's so many people that are hungry. A lot of people must feel very fearful because they're worried about their dependencies.
Look at the amount of gold that's being bought.
How much gold is being bought?
They're buying gold like has never happened before. The people who can still afford to buy gold, because they're hoping that if they buy gold, then the tremendous decline of the dollar in value, I mean, it's absolutely absurd. They can maybe freeze the value of their wealth. What they don't realize is that there's one value that's more important for them to freeze, and that's availability of food. Here's the situation. You talk about people being afraid. Yes, they are. 12 million American children, not the one that the movie stars, adopt, but American
Our
kids go hungry every night.
So
I'm not done.
Oh, okay.
50% or 50 million Americans, close to 50 million Americans, are on food stamps. Half the population of our country has to have some sort of help with their grocery budget, whether it's from the church, whether it's food stamps, whether it's the various government programs, or whether it's local assistance programs. Half the country. I live in a nice neighborhood. We were talking to one of the church leaders there, and he indicated to me that half the people in his parish area, half the people, and these are people that are living in nice homes, are getting church help, are getting government help, and some of them are in real deep trouble. You look at the number of people that, well, right now they're writing mortgages like crazy. They're writing mortgages because people are refinancing their homes to get down, from the payments that they can't afford. At the same time, millions of people are being cast out of their homes and living in cars and living on the street and are homeless, and on and on and on and on and on. So things are very, very horrible for a lot of people. And do you think that, as you have a solution? Let's talk there for a second. You have a solution with your food, and that is food is like gold. And so, just for a minute, can you share the solution that you've shared with on the Alex Jones show, just for listeners to know what you do and what you're so successful, because you're everywhere. You're the go-to person as a food expert. You're the person that has a solution that can help a lot of people with that basic need, that basic dependence, which is food. Well, you have to understand that food is your most important dependency, and if people will build a savings account in food, they can deal with some very interesting things. If you have a savings account in food, so you can feed your family, if you do lose your job, all of a sudden, one of the biggest expenses that people have each month isn't necessary. You can take what little money you have from unemployment or whatever and keep your home and keep your car, or just if you've got three big dependencies: transportation for a car, a home, and food. If you have to lose one of them, which one can you give away? Well, you can give away the car and you can ride the bus, or you can walk. Okay, you got two left: a house and food. Which one are you going to give up? You got to give up one of them. Well, you give up the home. If you still got food, you can be fearless to a great extent.
Now you've mentioned bread lines and the Great Depression, and I love that story. Could you share that with us? To kind of give an example.
Well, the one about my father or the bread lines themselves?
Well, both, actually.
Well, during the Great Depression, obviously they had bread lines, and I was living on a farm outside of Anoka, Minnesota, up there with the Swedes and Norwegians, but they would have groups of men, 5, 10 men, walking up Highway 10, which is the main drag up toward northern Minnesota, stopping at every farm, asking if they could work for $1 a day and dinner. Well, on the farm, dinner is the noon meal as opposed to in town. Right. Okay, so, but the problem is that none of the farmers could afford the $1 a day. To give you a perfect example, my dad shipped a whole carload of hogs, and that's a whole train carload of hogs down to South St. Paul, which is about 30 miles away from where we were, and to Swift and Company. And when he got his commission check back, he owed 50 cents for transportation.
After all that work.
Yeah. And so he kept the last 32 hogs, and he's the first guy, before Jimmy Dean, who made whole hog sausage, and selling. He had a sausage, egg, and butter route that he ran in 2 little towns twice a week, and that's how he kept the farm. And to my knowledge, it was the only farm that was held onto by the original owner during the Depression in that whole county. And so that's the type of stuff that was going on. But dependency. The families back then, 80% of them had ties to the family farm. Now, 90% of the people have no association at all with the family farms, where they can go home and get some groceries every weekend like they did. And so we're totally dependent. The farmers are totally dependent on each other. One grows the feed, the other one grows the cattle. If the farmers can't afford to grow the feed because of the ethanol program, where the government subsidizes ethanol corn but doesn't subsidize the farmers that are growing the feed for the cattle farmer goes out of business. You got no meat. You got no dairy products. You got no chickens. You got no turkeys. And all of a sudden meat prices are going to go nuts, and pretty soon there won't be any. And what's happening is right now we got 20,000 people in America. I believe the last figure that I heard, 20,000 people a day falling below the poverty line. It's not that their incomes are falling, it's that the poverty line is climbing. And so what are we going to do? Now here's the beautiful thing. We've just established that if people put in a supply of food, if they order food, they can get probably the best food on the planet, the cleanest food on the planet, for about half what they're spending for groceries right now through some of the operations that we've got going. But that's not the point. You become independent by taking care of your greatest dependency. You put in a supply of food, you put in a savings account in food.
Now, can you... Okay.
But we can do better than that. If you understand how things work, you don't have to be dependent in any way. You can, instead of being dependent on your job for the prosperity that it takes to put in the food, you can all of a sudden set your objective of having enough and state your goals of having a better job. Those of you who don't have a job can determine that you are going to have a job, and you can literally create it. All things are created right here, okay? And it's a spiritual thing. It's not a religious thing. It's how we as human, the magnificence of the human being as a creator. You do not have to have a life anything other than exactly what you want, and that is what we're covering in the book, and that's what we're going to be covering in this show. You can choose whether you like the situation that you're in, and you can choose to change it to whatever situation you want. And what we're going to do as best we can by teaching you the true principles, the universal laws of how things work, we're going to teach every soul out there their own personal magnificence, so they don't have to be dependent on the boss that says, well, you did a nice job, or you stink and you're out of here. Who cares? And the first place you start, the reason that we wrote the book and we tie the book with food, is that the first thing you start is you can become a believer by getting food, which takes you as your first dependency. And then once you become a believer in these principles by getting your food, then you go on and say, well, I can provide food. Now how about I provide a nice house? How about I provide a job? How about if I provide an education for my kids? How about if I build a relationship with my wife so she thinks that I'm still courting her, and I feel like I am still courting her, and we just get as hot for each other every time we see each other as we did when we first were sneaking around trying to get past our parents to go smooch. This is what life is about. Man is that he might have joy. And woman is that she might enjoy the man that is a decent guy having joy. He's not a grouchy old, I shouldn't use that word on TV. Oh, never mind. Okay. He's not a stinker.
So this is the passion I'm talking about. This is the Steve Shank. I mean, you have already provided a solution to the nation, and if not the world's big problem. You have a storable food that's delicious, it's gourmet, it's healthy, non-GMO, it's incredible. Check it out. But we're here to talk about the most important, the bridge to that. The most important thing is this book that you've written based on your years of experience from, your dad and being raised as a farmer's son in Minnesota on through your life of entrepreneurship and sales and experience in homes all across the country, providing the solution. You have put together this book that is it's unparalleled. There's nothing like it out there in the marketplace, and it does remind you of this magnificence. And it's not something it's difficult to put down once you start. But it's changed my life, and it's changed so many other people's who have read this and applied these principles. So in the next show, we're going to talk about how the book is set up. There's people in the book that you want to hear about. So we're going to talk about those, and each week on the show we're going to talk about the principles that are part of this. So Steve, can you talk a little bit maybe about what made you a successful entrepreneur? You're doing things all over. You traveled everywhere. What made you sit down and write this for other people?
Well, as I was struggling, there's a little plaque I have in my office that at one point in time things were just really crummy. We were having a hard time making a house payment, the car payment, and buying groceries. And this thought just came to mind. Necessity is the mother of invention, but terror is the father of pure inspiration. and I was terrified. Again, the fear of all of the dependencies that we had, having to pay the bill and stuff. And one of the things that we need to talk to everyone about is this death, this walking death called indebtedness. Because what happens is we have our life, we have so much liberty in our lives to give away. When we make decisions, we carve out a portion of that life and we commit it. For example, if we decide to buy a car, okay, whatever the payment is on the car, if we don't have the cash for it, we have just carved X number of hours of work time every single week out that we can't use for anything else that has to go to that car. And so what happens is, as we choose to get married, big carve out, have kids, big carve out, have cars, homes we can't afford, doing all this kind of stuff, getting in debt past our ability to afford it, all of a sudden, we have spent our entire life. You see, when I used to tell my teenagers that when they asked for that $20 bill to go on a date, I remember my brother used to get $5 bills to go on his date. And now, then when I was raising my kids, I gave them a $20 bill to go on a date, and now it's even worse than that. But You know, I would kid him and say, that's my life's blood. Well, oddly enough, it is. It is. Every committed dollar that you have takes a little piece out of your life that you can't use for anything else. And so we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at the decisions. One of the nice principles on decisions is kind of fun. It's called, can you afford to be wrong? If we make every decision that we make based on can you afford to be wrong, it might be interesting. If you got time, I'll give you a little example.
Okay.
Let's take it back to the scriptures. Noah and the ark. You know, all the people were outside the ark laughing at Noah. He was out there going foompa foompa and sawing and building on that ark for something like 40 years. At least that's what they tell us. And he was building this ark out in the middle of nowhere, and there wasn't a drop of rain, or there wasn't a lake around to float the thing on. And they were all making fun of him and saying Noah's, half a bubble off with one oar in the water and a brick shy of a load.
That's a Steve Shankism, by the way. You'll get more of those.
But anyway, so then the drizzle comes, and the people have a choice. Noah says, hey, you can come on board. No, okay. So Noah decided to build the ark. The people decided not to get on the ark. Which one could afford to be wrong? If Noah was wrong, he had a whole bunch of time and energy and sweat and blood into building that silly ark. And if it was just sitting there out in the middle of the desert and there was no rain or anything like that, yeah, it was a little bit stupid. It was a waste of time and energy, but no harm, no foul. The guys that decided not to, if they were right and there was no rain, then they're great. But if they were wrong, they were dead wrong. So if you look at the decisions that we make, whether to buy that car or not, whether to whether to marry that guy or not, he might look like a gem, but he might turn out to be a lump of coal. But you've got all of this stuff going on. If you can afford to be wrong on a decision, that's one of the things we're going to be covering too. So it's going to be fun.
So stay tuned. Again, this is Steve Shank. You can find him on Facebook, steveshank.me. This is Kim Powers-Stilson. We've been hosting the show, It's Not Your Fault. You can catch us every week right here on the Roku box and on your TV and as well on the internet. Thanks for joining us on It's Not Your Fault.
Thank you.